In 1944, Harry Dexter White was just one of the people who were looking ahead to the end of the Second World War, grappling with the problem of how the world could recover. And while recovering, could avoid the sort of economic instability, competitive devaluations that had fueled the start of the conflict in the first place. In other words, White, and others like him, were focused on how you could establish a new global economic system that would avoid some pretty serious problems that the world had just gone through. He proposed what became the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, one of the two institutions, the others being the International Monetary Fund, that was created at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. The IBRD was set up to provide loans for the reconstruction and redevelopment of war-torn Europe. But as it morphed into the World Bank of today, it took on the wider mission of lending to developing countries around the world to help end global poverty and encourage positive economic progress. Now, although the scale of the task as defined there is large and complex, nevertheless, it could be argued that it had one job: to become a benign and public-minded lender of first resort to the poorest countries to help them to escape poverty. And this on the enlightened self-interested principle that nations that became overwhelmed by debt, well, we'd seen to our cost how their problems could quickly become the world's problem. It was cheaper, better, less likely to have explosive consequences if such problems could be solved early rather than ignored until they were too late. Over the decades, it's done some things that arguably supported that mission, as well as obviously making mistakes, getting mired in bureaucracy and corruption, and all the things that such institutions are prone to. But at least it had a clear mission. Today, there has been vigorous debate that this mission is not enough, and specifically that as well as promoting the end of poverty, the World Bank should also be positioning itself as a principal vehicle for advancing action on climate change. Not only that, but this is happening just as the challenge of China's emergence as a significant lender and investor in developing countries is putting the whole notion of that post-World War II financial system seriously in question. China's approach to lending is building a parallel system of loyalties, but doing so in a way that seems less benign and less careful of consequences. This feeds on decades of criticism that the bank was set up to promote the interests of the United States as the dominant world power, not to represent the interests of the borrowing countries. So how do we make sense of all this in a way that looks past the bewildering complexity of global institutions to the crucial jobs that need to be done in the world today? Because even if we don't currently have a war-ravaged continent to patch up, we do have some increasingly serious issues. More than 70 low-income nations currently are facing a collective debt burden of $326 billion. About 15% of low-income countries are in what's labelled as debt distress, and another 45% rated as having high debt vulnerabilities. Some would add to that equation the imperative for all those countries, however poor they may be, to rapidly transition away from fossil fuel energy to zero carbon energy on a rapid timescale, and hence some of the recent debate. Now, you might start by asking, why does the World Bank have to take on climate change as a big factor? I mean, even if you're fully committed to the idea that an energy transition needs to happen across the world, why can't this institution focus on its one job, while other people focus on that separate job? Some people say, oh, well, climate change is so important, it should be at the heart of every institution. Does it though? To use an analogy, processing food is essential to my body's survival. I would be in kind of a poorer place if the cells in my hand, in my heart, in my brain all decided that food digestion was so important that they would start doing that instead of the specific functions that they currently have. Even important things don't need to be the job of every single institution, although it's always a natural tendency for those who specialise in those things to argue otherwise. In the case of the World Bank, there are those who argue that the job of reducing poverty remains so utterly crucial and more urgent in the last couple of years, not less. Now, those putting the case that the World Bank should have a climate focus would counter that its one big job is not isolated from the process of generating greenhouse gas emissions. Indeed, there's already an overlap. Specifically, if its projects constitute lending to developing countries in order to create fossil fuel energy generation, then it's potentially adding to the one problem by addressing the other, whereas it should at least be focused on ways to address both at the same time, or address one in a benign way to the other. Which is all very well, but that's not the definition of the problem. To take future lending and make it climate friendly. It's really to answer the question, how can a world with middle income and poorer countries shift existing functional energy sources from polluting technologies to cleaner ones? And to do so, by the way, without impoverishing those countries during the transition. Those loans for fossil fuel projects were, after all, not just done to annoy environmentalists. They were providing essential development for countries that needed reliable energy and still do. The answer, of course, is this can only be done with an extremely large amount of money, the true cost of which is often not entirely clear when people address the topic in abstract. To put it in perspective, in the last fiscal year, the World Bank committed $115 billion of finance, mostly for development, which is a sizable sum, and one much needed in the face of recent global conflicts and, of course, the pandemic that has made financial conditions for many countries significantly worse. But the bank estimated that if you were to add climate change to the job list, supporting all those countries to transition and to adapt to climate change as well, that annual bill would rise 20 times to $2.4 trillion in total spending between now and 2030. Why so much? Well, according to the bank, low and middle income countries host nearly 90% of the $1 trillion in global coal-fired power generation, which is, quote, at risk of being stranded. They put it that way because the alternative vision, that those assets continue to generate energy while polluting the atmosphere for decades to come until they become obsolete, that's not an option they want to put into anyone's head. That brings the question back to the one that has held up progress at more global summits than anything else. Where does the money come from? US Treasury and government officials have said maybe there will need to be more capital inputs, but they said the United States, notwithstanding its status as the richest nation in the world, cannot commit to channeling more cash. It has debt and deficit problems of its own it has to worry about. We're back to the problem of the magic money tree. Specifically that so far, even with the miracle of genetic engineering, no such tree has ever been discovered. You can add to that the question marks that people always have over large, sprawling global institutions, which is how effectively do they use the money they get anyway? Mohammed El-Erian, the chief economic advisor at investment firm Allianz, was quoted this week as saying, "If I was a decision maker, I would not go out and try to get more money for the World Bank right now. I would go out instead and prove that the bank can use its existing money much better. Developing countries are mixed about this. Those that feel they can make a strong case to being disproportionately at risk from the impact of climate change, while having, by the way, contributed little to creating the problem in the first place, believe that more funds focused on climate would be a potential windfall for them, and one that they particularly need because of those impacts. But a number of other developing nations, particularly in Africa, have expressed concerns that shifting focus towards reducing emissions would steer capital that they want for poverty reduction and development to comparatively wealthier nations. In other words, the original mission of abolishing poverty, they say, is not yet completed. Those in the queue don't think the mission should be changed until they've benefited like some of the others already have. As ever, when large amounts of money are involved, countries follow the incentives that are most clearly in front of them that might enable them to get their hands on some of it. Well, whether they make their case strongly or not, the simple truth of the size of the bill means that not much is happening in the short term. After all, even the global powers are finding challenges with their own energy transition plans, more so than they had initially anticipated. Last weekend, a key summit that was meant to progress all of this concluded with an impasse. They managed a tweak to the bank's mandated ratio of equity to loans that freed up capacity to loan an extra $4 billion. Now, I hesitate to call that chump change, but it doesn't stand for long alongside that $2.4 trillion figure. And ironically, it doesn't matter much that the president of the World Bank, a Trump appointee, David Malpass, is about to give way to one who will certainly be more ideologically lined up for the progressive agenda. We expect that new president to be Rajiv Shah, who is believed to be Washington's preferred candidate and was formerly the head of the US Agency for International Development. You might think, well, just because he's Washington's preferred candidate, that presumably doesn't mean that he's guaranteed to get the post. Except that pretty much, yes, it does. You see, back in 1944, the world was much clearer about the then geopolitical status quo. The price of agreeing two significant entities as the World Bank and the IMF, remember, any great powers will always be reluctant to cede power to global bodies, was that governance of those bodies would be firmly kept in control. Specifically, it was agreed that the president of the World Bank would always be chosen by the US administration. Europe, in the meantime, got to pick the managing director of the IMF. And so it has been ever since, to the growing annoyance many of those emerging powers in other parts of the world, not least in Beijing and New Delhi, the two most populous and fastest growing nations on the planet. Not only that, but of course there have always been criticisms about some of the terms that come with the lending of the World Bank and the IMF. The onerous economic reforms that are kind of focused on trying to prevent those countries from getting deeper and deeper into debt. Such reforms often give governments political difficulties at home as the various austerity measures hit their populations. So it shouldn't be a surprise that a front has opened up for an alternative source of lending to the World Bank and the IMF, and that has provided a perfect opportunity for those who would like to break and replace the current global financial system. Because it's not as though they can't now find common cause with a fair number of other nations who feel themselves locked out of the existing regime. And perhaps that's why China is now catching up with the World Bank and the IMF, as well as being well ahead of other governments as the largest lender to significant parts of the developing world. It kicked into high gear with China's Belt and Road Initiative over a decade ago, as it sought to buy influence with potential partners. Beijing's approach was much more transactional, far less concerned with all those onerous conditions, but very clear that it was keen on things like winning access to oil and to minerals and to other commodities. This created de facto a bipolar system. No longer were the Bretton Woods institutions the only game in town. Now we had another major operator working directly with borrowers and very much following its own rules. This is now starting to become a real problem, because however well or badly crafted they may have been, those old rules were kind of there for a reason. And now that the global financial system is, let's face it, under significant stress, with inflation and an energy crisis and war and all the rest of it, the amount of debt distress has shot up. And China has been seeing for itself the results of its more risk-tolerant approach to lending. For instance, Zambia, a major borrower from China, defaulted on its public debt 2 years ago. Other countries like Sri Lanka and Ghana, Ethiopia and Pakistan, heavily indebted to China, have already defaulted or are teetering on the edge. China is not much inclined to forgive any of its debt. Up until this week, it was arguing that it certainly wouldn't get involved with sovereign debt restructuring unless the World Bank and the IMF did the same. Now, the World Bank dismisses that demand, saying that its development financing comes with low interest rates and doesn't add majorly to a country's debt burden. Wealthy countries that have historically lent to developing nations are part of what's called the Paris Club. Through that, they would negotiate with governments in distress to usually end up writing down their debt, something that was done with a number of poorer African nations in the 1990s and the early 2000s. China's approach has been different. Its loans come at a higher commercial rate than those offered elsewhere, rates that are attractive mainly to those who see themselves as having few other options. Borrowers are often required to sign non-disclosure agreements that prevent them from sharing information about what they owe to Chinese institutions that might become part of horse trading and talking about debt write-downs. And if China does offer concessions, they come in the form of rescheduling payments, not actually forgiving part of the debt. America and others argue that it's just basic economic reality that says that unless Beijing looks to write down some of that debt, it will simply never get repaid. So this is an interesting moment we find ourselves in. A world under stress. Up until the pandemic hit in 2020, we had been making steady and ongoing progress in reducing absolute poverty worldwide. That progress was coming at an environmental cost that we knew we had to address, because ultimately it would begin to undermine the progress if we didn't. Ultimately, you can't reduce poverty forever if the environment is collapsing around you. But that was doable in theory. Adopt the dual aim of continuing to build human well-being, but in ways that have fewer negative consequences that you then have to deal with. But now we have a much sharper edge to deal with. Poverty up since the pandemic, exacerbated by global inflation and supply chain disruptions and all the rest of it. China's alternative profile as a lender to support its leadership in the bipolar world it's aiming to create, under pressure, as its uncompromising approach is being hit in the face by reality. Western decision makers likewise piling on pressure over what seems on the face of it to be unrealistic expectations on the scale and pace of climate action, and apparently careless to the impact that that may have on reducing poverty. Something you would say has to give, probably on both sides. And the idea that absolute poverty will just continue its relentless push downwards after this brief pandemic pause may sadly be the first casualty of this clash of big power interests that is happening before our eyes. Now look, none of this is going to make headlines in this fractious, polarised political time that we're living in. But it will nevertheless have more impact on the lives of people across the world than just about anything else we could be concerning ourselves with. As we say, there is everything to play for. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.